Good afternoon. Can you hear me? My name is Virginia McDermott, and I have the delightful privilege of introducing Megan Kelso to you. What?
You've got to keep your fingers off the paper.
Oh! Okay. Thank you. I timed this. It's 3 minutes. It's too long. So bear with me. I'm going to talk about Megan, and Megan's going to talk about her work because she knows it better than I do. Anyway, I first met Megan in 1970 after we bought a house at the bottom of the street where Megan's Kelso and her family lived at the top of the street. She was about a year old, and my daughter Katie and Jenny and Megan's sister Jenny were about 5 and 6 years old. As Jenny and Megan's mom and I became friends, so did the girls. For years, the girls toggled back and forth between our houses, playing games, and at our house and at theirs, working on a crafts project. I still own one of their increasingly complex advent calendars. Megan's grandma provided a rich supply of varied and beautiful papers. Megan was drawing all the time. To bring myself up to date on the trajectory of Megan's career as a graphic novelist, I Googled her name. The first article began, Megan Kelso began self-publishing in 1968. Now, that seemed a little odd to me because Megan wasn't born yet. She was probably still a twinkle in her father's eye, so I decided to re-Google her, and that's when I found out that she began to self-publish in 1991 as a college student. She mimeographed 50 copies of her first piece called Girl Hero. That year, she also sent me a Christmas card of Santa Claus in a traditional red and white outfit, only this year, Santa Claus had curls and a girl's face. The caption was, this year, Santa is a girl. I kept it a long time, so I could just look at it and grin. Since then, she's been creating graphic novels that other people publish and racking up excellent reviews, accolades, and awards. Her topics cover a wide range, and I must say that the ones that I love the most are the ones whose content I recognize from years in Megan's life. For instance, in 2007, Megan became the first woman to publish a series of comics in the New York Times Sunday magazine. It is a thinly veiled account of Megan's mother, who in 1973, like half the US, was obsessed with the Watergate hearings. At one point in the story, Megan's mom turns to her father and says, "We have to get a new TV. This one's broken." Her father replies, "That's because you destroyed it the other night when you were yelling at Nixon's comments." What really amused me is that it occurred to me that about the same night that Megan's mother was destroying her TV, my children's father, in a fury, flung his boot at our TV and almost, but not nearly, destroyed it. In 2021, Megan was chosen to install a piece of public art in the Seattle Center on the east side of the new Climate Pledge Arena. It's an 85-foot long etched steel installation of 23 panels that tell the stories of people and events from 1969 to 2021 that have shaped Seattle. Last year, her latest book, Who Will Make the Pancakes, which is 15 years in the making, I'm bragging now for Megan because she won't, was named by the British newspaper The Guardian, as well as the Publishers Weekly in the United States, as one of 5 best graphic novels of 2022. After 30 years of steady work, Megan is recognized as a star. She's famous. And all that recognition is well-deserved. For me, an additional personal pleasure comes from the annual Christmas breakfast where the Kelso women and the McDermott women share good food and bring each other up to date on careers like Megan's, life events and opinions on everything else. A little hard to get airtime, but we managed. This breakfast began in the mid-90s when the girls came home from vacation and has repeated with only a few breaks right up to this year. This year, our granddaughters came. And they're both at Garfield High School, where our daughters graduated. And they regaled us with variations on the tales that our daughters told us about life at Garfield. It was hilarious. It was satisfying, and it's grounding, and it's lovely. Here's Megan.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Okay, here I go. So I'm going to back up a little bit. This is a picture of me soon after my new book came out last November at a comics festival. So you can catch a little glimpse of what the cover of the book looks like. So here's a couple panels from one of the stories in the new book. And what I'm going to talk about today is, so most of my work is fictional. Most of my work, I make up the stories. Of course, there's bits and pieces from my own life. I think that's true of every author. But one of the stories in this book is very autobiographical, which was like kind of a new experience for me. And it made me really think about what my strategies are for creating stories. And I realized actually that the strategies for the fictional and the autobiographical were quite similar in a lot of ways. One of the things I really like to do in my stories, even if they're naturalistic and real events, is use visual metaphors. So this story with these panels is called The Golden Lasso. And I don't know if you're familiar with the superhero Wonder Woman, but one of her things she has is a lasso of truth. And so in this story, the character who's based on me that makes a lasso of truth out of a plastic clothesline. So here's a picture of me and my mother when I lived up the street from the McDermotts. And I'm about 13 in this picture, and that's about the age that I am in that autobiographical story that I just showed you a panel from. My mother died about 5 years ago, and I miss her a lot. And her presence really hung over this book. She's always, in a way, kind of been my muse. She was a really good storyteller. And it's funny because so many of my stories contain elements of fabulism, like things that couldn't quite happen. And my mother was a serious realist. She didn't like fantasy. But what she did like was people's voices. And so when she told stories, she would always kind of mimic the voices of the characters involved. And I think that had a really big influence on me as a storyteller. I get a lot of my ideas from dreams. I have a very vivid and active dream life. And many years ago, when my daughter, it was before my daughter went to kindergarten, and we were living in this small house in South Seattle, I had a dream that I had as many servants as the Downton Abbey family. I had this entire staff, and it was wonderful. They washed my dishes and did everything for me, but it was really crowded in my little house. And this dream just kind of stuck with me, and I knew I wanted to somehow put it in a comic. And when I kind of got down to drawing, I had just been drawing cats constantly for my daughter. She was always like, "Draw me a cat, draw me a cat." So I drew my staff my household staff from the dream as cats. And it just kind of cracked me up, so I just kept going. So this is a panel from the story that came out of that called Cats in Service. And the events of the story have really nothing to do with that original dream, except for this large household staff I have in my tiny house. And I really didn't know what the story was going to be at first, but I was at a point in my work where I wanted to get more intuitive. Like, I didn't want to write a script and then turn it into a comic. I wanted to just draw for a while and see where these cats would go and what would become of them. And I just kept drawing them, you know, doing all my chores basically, and it was like wish fulfillment, because, you know, when you're the parent of a small child, it feels like there's just nothing but housework, and it was just so satisfying to have all the cats do everything. So I kept going with that, and then I reached this point where I started having questions about them, like, well, where did they come from exactly, and why do they have these adorable outfits, and how do cats know how to do housework? And so it was these questions that I asked of myself that kind of forced me to turn it into a story. So you'll have to get the book if you want to see what happens with the cat nanny. So here's a panel from another story in this book called The Egg Room, and it was also based on a dream. And this dream, I think I was in, you know how there's those beautiful department stores in London, which I've never been to, but I've heard about, like Harrods, and I've heard they have these amazing food halls where you can get tea and biscuits and all kinds of packaged foods. So I had this dream, I was in a store like that, and they had a food hall, and they had an entire room devoted to eggs from all over the world. And some of them were edible, and some of them were decorative, and they were displayed in really cool ways, and it was just this feast for the eyes. And so when I woke up from that dream, I just knew again, like, I have to do something with this in a comic. But the dream was just a mess. It didn't have a narrative story. So again, it was just this image that I was starting with and playing around with, and then the story came later. And I went on a residency a few years later where I had 3 weeks, and all I had to do was work on comics. They cooked our meals, and we were in this beautiful place in Florida. And I decided how I wanted to spend my time was to begin as many stories as I could. And so I began the Egg Room there, and this is a couple of the very first panels that I drew. And as you can see, they're very rough and, you know, not very well figured out or composed. But I was just trying to begin with what I could exactly picture in my head before I had a story, and then I was gonna, like, kind of spread out from there. And then as I was going with this story, I worked in other things that were in my sketchbook. This was a drawing I did of a little family at a bus station in Spokane, and it's hard to explain, but I think if you're an artist, you can kind of relate to this, that sometimes there's just heat around a certain image, and you have to draw it or you have to paint it. You're just drawn to it, and I still can't really explain, but there was something about this woman and her 2 boys that I pulled out my sketchbook and I drew them, and it's not like I'm constantly sketching, but I was just drawn to them for some reason. And I just started to think that they had something to do with the Egg Room. And then the Crest movie theater, I somehow worked in there too. And again, I was at the Crest one night watching a movie, and as I was leaving, I saw this older couple drive away in this little beat up Honda Civic, and I can't explain it, but I just kept thinking about them, and I wanted them to be in my story. My kind of metaphor for how I make stories is I wind up a ball of yarn, and as I'm winding this ball of yarn, like, I add in lots of disparate things, and the ball of yarn just kind of gets bigger and bigger. And eventually I have to write to figure out the story. I can't figure out all of it just by drawing. I try to begin with drawing, but eventually, like with the cats, I have questions, and then I do quite a lot of writing. So with the egg room, this older woman who I'd seen at the Crest, who became a character for me, she gets tangled up with this younger man, but I couldn't quite figure it out. So I had to do a lot of writing to figure out what the deal was between them. So here is a finished page from that story, which you can see I did in watercolor. And the reason, because I don't do a lot of watercolor, but that initial dream about the egg room was so colorful and vivid. And the story actually wound up being quite a lot about different kinds of dreams and sort of the role that dreams play in our lives. I just felt like watercolor, the way it's kind of slippery and blurry, just would really express that kind of dreamy feeling of this story. So another way into stories for me is through photographs. This is a picture of me and my sister Jenny in the parking lot of my grandmother's apartment building in Tacoma. And we visited her a lot and stayed with her when my parents went away a lot when I was a kid. And she'd been a career woman in the 40s, and she had beautiful clothes from that period. And we loved to play dress up with her old clothes. So this is a picture she took of us in all of our finery. And then this is a couple panels from a comic I did about 15 years ago about dressing up at my grandma's house. And it was just a one-page comic, but I finished it and I just knew there was more there. And so I began this story called Corinne Voss. And the heroine of this story, Corinne, is loosely based on my grandmother. This single mother in the late 40s, raising two girls and supporting her family. And I made a kind of fantasy Tacoma, but if you're familiar at all with Tacoma, you might recognize some elements of it. But I never named it as Tacoma. But I looked at a lot of family photographs and just kind of became a documentarian of my grandmother's life. And I knew I didn't want to do her actual life story, but I wanted to capture the milieu of her adult life, which, I didn't really know that much about because she was an old lady when I knew her. So luckily she saved a lot of stuff. So I had some kind of cool old letters to look through. And she had this tendency to annotate everything. Like, you can see, like, she noted down some interesting facts about this letter that were like little clues. So I have a very sort of childish relationship with Tacoma. She took us to this drive-in Frisco Freeze a lot, and I didn't really know much about the history of the town. But as I was developing this story, that started out very personal, having to do with her life, I wanted to learn more about Tacoma. Here's a picture of her. Ms. Vivian Gaston. And Tacoma has a lot of industry, and one of the one of the industries in Tacoma was a copper refinery called Asarco, which is now, it was cleaned up. It was a Superfund site, and they capped it, and now it's a park. But in the 90s, it was closed down. There was a copper refinery, but the buildings hadn't been ripped down yet, and they hadn't done the cleanup work yet. And I was kind of upset. This was when I was in college. I was kind of obsessed with industrial ruins at the time. And so I went and I took these pictures, and I found them when I was starting to flesh out my Corinne Voss story, and I thought, yeah, that's where she works. She works at the copper refinery. So another thing that I learned about Tacoma is that it was a very important destination for the Great Migration of Black people from the South, leading up to the war, during World War II, and after World War II, because there was so much industry, and there was also the Army bases and the Air Force Base. So there were a lot of job opportunities. And so because of learning that in my research, I decided I wanted to have Corinne have some Black neighbors, because she loses her job at the refinery and has very little money and has to move to less expensive lodgings, and she winds up in a primarily Black neighborhood. And I'll be honest, I haven't drawn a lot of Black characters in stories that I've done before. And I wanted to do my best to get that right. Comics are interesting. They're, in a lot of ways, they're abbreviations, and comics use a lot of symbolic language and imagery. And it's easy to stray from abbreviation into exaggeration and caricature. And people of color in this country have been very unfairly caricatured in comics, in the history of comics, and I didn't want to do that. So I'm going to back up. I found this really cool book called, it's by a photographer named Al Smith, Seattle on the Spot. And he did a lot of photographs along Jackson Street. There were tons of jazz clubs in the post-war period. And he took these wonderful photographs of people out having fun and dressed in exactly the kind of clothes that I was doing research for this story. So I used that book a lot, but I also just drew people. And I just drew people with an eye towards, it's hard to explain, like abbreviation and simplification, but not stereotyping. Another bit of research I did was the Library of Congress has these amazing photo collections, and a lot of them are now digitized and online. And one of the collections they have is color photographs from the 1940s, which are fairly rare. Color photography wasn't something that the general public had access to in the 40s. So it's just really kind of surreal, I think, to see, since I didn't live in the 40s, to see the 40s represented in color. So those pictures were really helpful to me when I was doing my research. So a lot of what I did was I just drew photographs. This isn't a panel from the comic, it's just me sort of practicing getting the look of the world at that time. So my research, it was sort of toggling back and forth this really personal stuff, reading my grandmother's letters and looking at family pictures, but then also researching the broader world and Tacoma and trying to bring that stuff together into the story of this woman, Corinne. And one of the things I learned is that during the war, there was a shortage of nurses on the home front because so many nurses had gone off to war. And so for the first time, Black women had the opportunity to get training in nursing because they'd been excluded before that, but during the war you know, the government was just desperate. And so a lot of black women trained to be nurses for the first time during those years. So that's one of Cora's neighbors who she meets, and she's kind of surprised that this woman is a nurse. Here's another panel from that story, or page actually, 4 panels. So Virginia referred to Watergate Sue, which is the story that begins this book and is the oldest story I did. I did it in 2006 and 2007. And it was when I was living in New York, and I got hired to do a serial comic for the New York Times Magazine. For some reason, this is being reproduced as a black and white image. It actually was in color. I'm not sure why. But anyway, this is what it looked like when it was in the magazine. And so again, it is drawn from my life and my mother's life, but I made up the events of the story. But the main character is this woman named Eve, who is a young mother during the Watergate scandal, and she becomes really obsessed with watching it on TV and following it in the news. Here's a picture of my mom and my sister and me, probably a few years before Watergate. Actually, we're over on the Olympic Peninsula. And this is the famous TV. My mom got so mad one night during one of Nixon's speeches that she kicked the TV over. And actually, she didn't completely break it. She just knocked the little knob off that you turned it on and off. And forever after that, we had to turn that TV on with pliers. Anyway, I mean, I didn't really need research to remember that TV. It was pretty etched in my brain. But the New York Times was super persnickety with their fact-checking, and I would have to submit the pages to the fact-checking department, and they wanted to know what exact Sony model of TV. I know, because I used the box in one of the panels. Do you see how she's propping up she's set the TV right on the packing box? And they said, well, you have to, if that box is going to be in the panel, you have to have the right model number. It was very strange working with the New York Times. It was an honor, but it was strange at times. So yeah, here's a couple panels from Watergate Sue. And again, it was this combination of doing family and personal research, talking to my mom about what pregnancy was like in those days, because the main character gets pregnant, and talking to my aunts and getting personal details, but then also doing research about Watergate, because I wanted the story to actually somewhat explain the events of Watergate to people who weren't familiar with those events. So I came up with this crazy matrix, basically, to align the events in Eve's life and the stages of her pregnancy with the historical events of Watergate, to make sure that all the episodes would work out. And I honestly, I don't think I could do this story today. It looks too hard. But one of the things that's in the story is this character that I made up named Agnes Bluebird, who's a kind of domestic goddess, and she has a column in a woman's magazine that Eve reads, and she was a little bit based on Peg Bracken, who did this cookbook called the I Hate to Cookbook that my mother loved. and also like Irma Bombeck and Hints from Heloise, and all these women that I remember from my childhood in the newspaper. So there's the strips that are like Eve's life and the events of Watergate, and then there are occasionally these little strips along the top of the story about what's going on with Agnes Blueberg as she's trying to like get rid of sweat stains or fold sheets properly, stuff like that. So that's about all I have to say about my book. I did bring copies of it, and I can sell it to you today if you have any interest. But concurrently with the book, I was working on this other big project, which was public art for the hockey arena. They had an art budget, so they have, I think, 6 new art pieces ranged around the outside of the arena, because they completely re-landscaped the whole area around the arena when they were renovating it. And I lucked out and found out about the opportunity and applied for it and was selected. So my piece is called Commute, and it's mounted on guardrails. There are these stainless steel panels that are 3 feet wide and about 1 foot high. And so they're mounted all in a line. They make up 85 feet. So it's kind of like a mini mural in a way. And my drawings are etched into the stainless steel panels and then filled with black paint. So they look, here's one of the artwork from one of the panels. They look like my drawings, but they're etched into metal. And my first idea was I wanted to show people leaving what I think it was called the Coliseum back then, leaving the Coliseum after Jimi Hendrix played there in 1968. And I just, again, like sometimes I'll be able to picture something in my mind. I don't know where it's going, but it's got heat around it, is the way I describe it. And so I just pictured all these people leaving the concert. And then I was talking to a friend of mine who was a teenager and went to that concert, and he said, you know, it was raining when we all came out. It was pouring down rain. And so I added that to my vision of what that was going to look like. So I took 2 panels to show it. So that's, you can kind of see the left side of the Coliseum, and then right next to it there's another panel that looks almost exactly like it, only it shows the right side. And then as I started to develop the idea, I wanted to do a portrait of the city. And at first I was very grandiose and thought the entire history of Seattle. But then I realized that was just too big. And because I had this like really strong vision of the Jimi Hendrix concert, and because the concert was in 1968, which is the year I was born, I thought, okay, that'll be the beginning. It'll start in 1968 and it'll go up to the present. So it'll be a portrait of Seattle as long as I've lived here. I wound up turning it into 1969 because he played 2 years in a row, and 69 was the rainy one. And I really wanted to do the rain. So those are the middle panels, and then it kind of goes outward, north and south. And so it works as a combination timeline and map of Seattle. So it's hard to capture all 85 feet in one picture, as you can see, but I think this picture gives a pretty good idea of what it looks like. And the very middle panel is yellow. The woman in the vest is standing in front of the very middle panel. And the yellow panel is from pre-colonization time. So what I learned is that where Climate Pledge Arena was before settlers came, before colonization. It was a prairie, and it was one of those prairies that the first people had maintained as a prairie by burning it every few years, because they could harvest certain plants from there, they could hunt birds, and so I wanted to draw that place before our descendants came. And so the yellow panel is time immemorial, I guess is what we call it now. And then it skips to 1969, and then the whole piece kind of moves forward in time in both directions. It's a little bit hard to explain. You should basically just go down to the Seattle Center if you can and take a look at it. It's right by it's at the corner that's by the Children's Theater. And this is an extreme close-up so you can see what I mean by etching. So it's got raindrops on it, but also some of the lines are etched and filled with black paint, and then some of the lines are cut all the way through the metal, which gives it different looks in different light, which was really a cool discovery I made, because I've never made artwork that was meant to be looked at outside, and every time I go see it, it looks different depending on the light and the weather, which is really fun. There's one last picture of one of the end panels of Commute. And that's all I have to say as far as my prepared talk. But if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
In the elevators advertising your talk today, it shows a cartoon panel, perhaps from this series, featuring Vi Hilbert. And I'm wondering if you could tell me or us a little bit about that, and is that part of the time history there?
Yes, it is. It is, and thanks for asking me. So as I was trying to figure out, like, well, what exactly will a portrait of Seattle be or include, I knew that I wanted to engage with the indigenous history of this place and of Seattle, and I didn't want to get tripped up by the kind of trope that white people often get caught up in regarding Native Americans, that it's the past and that they're part of history. And so I included a panel that's actually a comic strip about Vi Hilbert, because she was this amazing force in, I don't know, you obviously know about Vi, but for those of you who don't know, she is a woman from the Upper Skagit tribe, and she's older than my parents, so I'm guessing she was born maybe in the 20s, and she grew up speaking Lushootseed, which is the native language of all the local tribes in this area. And became really interested in hearing and preserving the stories of her relatives. And she got connected with an anthropologist at the University of Washington who also really wanted to preserve these stories and this history and these legends. And they worked together. There were some recordings that already existed, and I think they made more, and then Vi helped this anthropologist translate them, and they developed a written version of the Lushootseed language because it's an oral language. And then she wound up teaching Lushootseed at the University of Washington for quite a few years. And then she was also instrumental in helping local tribes on reservations develop Lushootseed language programs. And so language reclamation is a movement that's been going on all over the United States and Canada for decades now. But as far as this area, Vi Hilbert was kind of the woman at the crossroads where it kind of all really gained some momentum. And now there are, communities of, Lushootseed speakers throughout this area because of her, and it's being taught to children. So she is just, an amazing woman. She died in the early 2000s, I think. I never met her. I've only heard about her and researched her, but I knew that I wanted to include her because once you learn about her, you can't stop thinking about her. Also, I connected with her granddaughter, and her granddaughter helped me get the Lushootseed language elements of this piece correctly, because I wanted to have ordinary things in this piece that we all see all the time, like crows and slugs and blackberries, just the elements of this region. And I wanted to give them their Lushootseed name. So Jill, who's Vi's granddaughter, helped me get those right.
I'm completely new to this art form, and so I'm really interested in how you went from the drawings to the metal things. Did you do that yourself? Did you work with somebody? And this is so exciting to see this whole transformation. I really appreciate your coming. But
thank you.
I'd like to have some of the details.
Sure, yeah. It was all new to me too, because I'd only ever worked on paper. I'd only ever made books.
Yeah.
This is my first foray into three-dimensional art and public art. And so there was a woman who made up the art plan for Climate Pledge Arena. So she sort of picked kind of where the artwork was going to go and helped them put together a selection committee and drive that process. And she helped me a lot with figuring out how to even do this. And she suggested etched stainless steel. And this location, these panels mounted on guardrail, she had identified as a potential for artwork that would bring in someone like myself, that would bring in a cartoonist or a graphic illustrator, which is really cool because cartoonists and graphic illustrators don't get a lot of opportunity for public art. It's usually the sculptors and the tile workers. Unfortunately, she didn't have a suggestion to me of how to get such a thing fabricated, because she'd done it in the past, but her guy had gone out of business. So I started doing research, and I thought, well, clearly I want to get someone local if I can. And I found places that etched stainless steel. I found places that put paint into etching, and I found places that cut into stainless steel, but I didn't find a place that would do all three of those things that I wanted. And so it was going to be really expensive because I was going to have my panels go from one shop to the next. And I was really frustrated. And I did a lot of research on the web, and one night I found this place in Australia. And they said that they worked with artists a lot, and they did all three of these processes. So I wrote to them and I said, do you have any colleagues in the United States that do what you do? And they said, well, why don't you just work with us? And I said, because you're in Australia? And they were like, oh, it'll be no problem. We work with people overseas all the time. And the exchange rate with Australia was very favorable, and I didn't have a huge budget. So I decided to just go for it and have it fabricated in Australia. And I even was imagining myself going down there and, you know, checking to make sure that everything was going right once the fabrication started, but the pandemic put a stop to that. So it was a little strange having my art fabricated half a world away. And then it got kind of dire when it was time to ship it here, because they were put in a crate and put on a container ship just as the time when like all the ports were backed up and the whole supply chain thing went south. And so the home opener hockey game was in October of 2021, and everything was supposed to be ready, but my work was stuck on a container ship, and it didn't get installed until December. So I missed the home opener, but yeah, it was equal parts exciting and terrifying, engaging with this new medium.
Hi, I'm over here.
Yeah.
Hi, I just want to thank you. You have suggested that we don't have to start with words as a writer. You can start with drawing and characters and get them going before you even look for the words. And we have many, many people amongst us who are dabbling in writing, and we might just use that technique. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to learn about that.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that that was your takeaway from my talk, because, you know, we're educated within an inch of our lives to deal with the written word, which is great. I mean, I love writing and I love reading, but when it comes to creating, yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to begin there. And funny thing, I'm actually starting to teach a class at Hugo House tonight for writers, and it's called Comics for Writers. And the idea is to get more comfortable with drawing as your generative, creative tool. And the way I describe it is that you need to tie your writing self, you need to tie that behind your back and just give your drawing self a bit of a head start, because a lot of us have a lot less confidence in our ability to draw. And so we just need to shut that writer up just for a little while and let the drawer draw a few things, and then we can bring the writer back in to have more ideas about it.
Megan, did you, when you were a kid in classes, were you doodling all the time while the teacher was doing their thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I started drawing, you know, as they say, as soon as I could pick up a pen, yeah. But I kind of, I didn't pursue it aggressively, and so I felt like somewhere around my teen years, I wasn't making much progress. Like, I kind of drew what I drew, and I wasn't trying to expand my drawing vocabulary because I got interested in writing. And I can see from my own history that writing kind of, in a way, retarded my drawing abilities, because writing is what our culture is based on, you know, and it's what you learn in school. And you get more external rewards for writing.
Would you ever consider teaching a class like that here?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, how much art education did you have? How much, you know, the technique of three-dimensionality, of perspective, body composition, so to speak, how much of that did you have, and did that constrain your ability to just doodle characters?
That's a good question. Well, I took a little bit of art in high school, but not a lot. I took some drawing classes at the Experimental College at the University of Washington when I was a teenager, life drawing classes. That was a really cool experience. It made me feel like a real artist, you know, because we had like charcoal and nude models, and so that I think was what made me think I wanted to go to art school, which I did, and I went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I lasted one semester. It just wasn't for me. I realized that I wanted more of a well-rounded liberal arts education. You know, I didn't want to just be doing art. I wanted to know things about the world, and art school just wasn't a good fit for me. So I wound up going to Evergreen, and you know, they don't have majors at Evergreen, but I mostly studied history and political science, and kind of turned my back on art for a few years, but then it just kind of came back because I could never not do it. And that's when I started doing comics, and I think it was because it was this combination of words and images, which I'd never really been able to make a choice between. As far as the perspective and all of that, I kind of had to figure it out myself. I learned a lot from other cartoonists I met who had more training, and I read books and have just kind of cobbled it together over the years. And sometimes I feel a little insecure about it, but in a way I think I learn what I need to find out in order to solve the problem at hand, is sort of the approach that I've taken. So I feel pretty free. I think you were asking about whether I sometimes feel constrained by the training. I've heard people say that that's sometimes a struggle with them when they try and do comics, because comics are, you know, being a great drawer is not necessarily a requirement for doing good comics. And sometimes you can overly complicate things. And simplifying is important in comics. So, yeah, it's always a balance, you know.
The dreams that inspire you, are they color or black and white or both?
Color, always color. Color, color, color. How about you? Do you have black and white dreams? Oh, wow. Yeah, mine are always in color. Or the ones that stay with me, at least.
I was just going to follow up on the dream. I was very interested to hear that you use your dreams as sort of a fragment with not any real idea as to how it's going to go, because, you know, I've got dreams. I've never really thought of doing anything with them, but it might be fun to try sometime.
Yeah, I heartily recommend it. I read a book about, when I was a teenager, I read a book about recording your dreams. And the theory goes, the more you record them, the more you remember them. And, but lately, for years, off and on, I would jot down things that I remembered. But lately, I've been trying really hard to do a drawing first. Even if it's just a tiny fragment of the whole dream, I try and draw it first. And then if there's more to describe, I'll write. Because I've found that the drawing helps me, like later, months later, if I go back and look at the drawing, the dream comes back to me faster looking at the drawing than looking at the writing. So.
Draw in the middle of the night?
No, it's, you know, it's tough because most of my dreams that I record are weekend dreams. Because, you know, weekday mornings, it's really, like, I have to it has to be like really spectacular for me to like sidetrack my morning to sit down, and it's hard to get yourself to do it. It's really hard, which is why I've never done it regularly. I do it in fits and starts.
What are you working on now? What's your next project?
Well, I am a sort of idea hoarder, and I think I'm not alone amongst artists and writers. I think there's always a part of you that thinks, like, what if this is the last idea I ever have? Then what? So I have, in various caches around my house, I have little piles of ideas that I've written down or drawn, and including the dreams. And at this point, it's kind of ridiculous because I'm very slow at drawing comics. They take me a long time, and I've got other work to do. So there's no way I'll ever tackle all of these ideas. So I had this idea of running a little sort of challenge for myself of giving myself like a set amount of time, like maybe 2 weeks to work on each idea and get as much out as I can, and then move on to the next one, and then kind of have a contest among them. Like, which of you deserves or wants to be a longer story? So I don't know. I haven't started that yet, but I'm imagining it.
So I'm an artist, and when I talk to other artists, I always want to find out, when do you work, where's your space, you know, how does your art fit in your day? And so, as a writer artist, how does that work for you?
Well, I have a lot more time now that my daughter is almost 17, than I did when I started this book. When I started this book, it was rough, you know, because I was a stay-at-home mom, and she was taking up a lot of my time. And then as soon as she went off to kindergarten, I thought, okay, I'm gonna have a ton of time. My mom got sick, and then that kind of took up a lot of time. So now I feel like rich because I've got plenty of time, and yet I don't feel like I'm getting that much done. And that is probably because I just finished these 2 huge things, and I haven't really, I'm still doing like promotion for the book, and I haven't gotten into any kind of groove with the next project. But I would say my ideal working day is that I work in the morning, early afternoon, and then by then I get my brain just isn't as sharp, and it's better for doing things like answering emails or washing the dishes later on in the day. I'm definitely not a night owl. I really only work at night if I'm under some kind of deadline and I just have to get it done. And then I can kind of work at night, but I feel like I'm most sort of in tune with myself in the morning. And COVID kind of messed up my workspace because my husband is working from home now. And since he has the job that actually pays a regular salary and supports us, he got my workroom. Yeah, so now I work at the dining room table, which is a little not so great. Yeah, I hope he eventually goes back to the lab.
Well, thank you, Megan, for coming. Can we give her a big hand?